And for Hong Kong, we'll have more flooding because in time of typhoons, because of a rise in sea level, as you can see in this picture, a term which we call storm surge. That's the rise in sea level brought by typhoons, low pressure area, as well as the wind. And we look at the past, and you remember the figure 3.5 meter? That's in the past, that's a 3.5 meter level is a 50-year event. And you look at the middle column, if according to IPCC's projection, 0.6 of a meter, then a 3.5 meter event will become a 2-year event. And if it's going to rise by 1.4 meter, that would be catastrophic, in that we get more flooding quite often. Just watch what is a 3.5 meter event. This is a 3.5 meter event, and it happened only 2 years ago when we had Typhoon Hagupit. And the sad thing about that is that even with an IPCC 0.6 meter increase in the water level by the end of this century, even in the absence of typhoon, we still got flooding in low-lying areas in Hong Kong because of spring tide. Spring tide meaning that the sun, the moon, and the earth are in more or less a straight line. And that gives us a 3 meter spring tide nowadays. And if you add 0.6 meter to that, you get a 3.6 meters level twice a month. And if we are not careful, if we look at the right column, if we get a 1.4 meter, this event will be much advanced, not by the end of this century, it will be by the middle of this century. And so what can we do? Can Hong Kong deal with it? Can Hong Kong deal with the increase in sea level? If yes, what about the entire Pearl River Delta? There's so many people whose livelihood depends on the well-being of this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lee, for sharing with us your illuminating and detailed calculations of the impact of climate change and future trends for Hong Kong and southern China. As you may all know, the Hong Kong Observatory is the center for climate change research in Hong Kong. I would now like to invite our other panelists, Professor Pan and Dr. Drewry, to share their reactions with us and their insights onto how the types of scientific inquiry that you've heard so much about today is, and maybe is not, informing policy actions and debates in your world and also about your research. So I'll turn to you now, and then we'll move to Q&A. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ms. Chairwoman. Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am not qualified to be on this panel. This is a scientific panel, but I was asked to have some input from a non-scientific point of view. Well, this would be good, so I have the freedom to say non-scientific issues. I do believe that I have been part of the IPCC for over a decade. The climate change issue is somewhat important, and I'm not qualified to say anything about whether it is real or not. But from a non-scientific point of view, I do believe that we have to take actions. For one reason is that the climate change security. We have the extreme climate events, which are very much detrimental to the economy, to livelihood, and also loss of human lives as well. Food and water securities are very much the concern for the developing countries, for very fragile and vulnerable regions like China. And of course, biodiversity is somewhat not that immediate to livelihood, but it's very much a concern for sustainability. And the second, I think that the supporting point is energy security, because for emission reduction, we have a reason for stabilizing greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere. But from my point of view, the more urgent issue is energy security, in particular fossil fuel energy consumption. Because we may have technologies to find more fossil fuel resources, but because of the finiteness of the planet Earth, in the future, the availability of such fossil fuels will be less and less. And according to the British Petroleum statistics for China, the oil reserve is only available for 11.3 years, but the current automobile ownership in China is only 1/10 of the OECD average and 1/15 of the American level. So that would mean that for the Chinese, we have to, if we are going to have automobile ownership, the level of 1/5 of the European level, and then we have to think about very seriously where the oil will be from. So this is something we have to think about, because this is very much immediate. In 10, 20, or 40 years, not very long, and then how we are going to deal with it. And currently, the energy consumption has reached over 3 billion tons of coal equivalent already, and it's slightly bit more than the American level of consumption already. And then how far we can go. I think that is why Mr. Sun from the NDRC of China indicated that we have to take we have to put some cap on some this sort of total energy consumption. And the third point I would like to say is that the sustainable development, for energy, for efficiency, economic efficiency, for environmental sustainability, and also for equity, both intragenerational and intergenerational equity issues. Having said, this urgency for taking actions, but there are quite a few issues we need to think about also very carefully. One is the so-called equal access to the emission space, because currently the occupation of the emission space is somewhat unequal, and we do have a divide between the poor and the rich in terms of emissions. Historically and currently, and probably projected for the future as well. And we need to get these issues resolved. And the second one is because in Johan's presentation there are a lot of dilemmas, and here I would like to add another one, that is low carbon dilemma. Because if you want to go low carbon, you have to go higher carbon first. Because this one is that we need to have some accumulation of the physical stock, and also for low carbon energy resources, you must require subsidy. And where the money from? The money has to be from the currently cheap fossil fuel resources. That means that you have more consumption of fossil fuels, and then you could have a higher level of resources to promote zero carbon energy resources. So this is a dilemma, but we need to strike for a trade-off, for a balance. And then the third issue is the rethinking and the redefinition of the quality of living. But the current paradigm for high quality of living does not seem to be that climate friendly. We need to, have a rethinking. What is the quality of living? Do we really a big houses, SUVs, and sorts of energy intensive and carbon intensive way of living? Is that healthy? Is that sustainable? So we need to really think about it. Otherwise, the poor people from the developing world would simply follow the way of living in the rich world, and that would not give us a future. Thank you.
Well, hello. Well, good morning, everybody. I've been really enjoying the amazing amount of data and the information that we've already received. And when you place that in the context of all of the reports, IPCC work that we've heard about, the real issue that I think is important is how is all of this digested in a way in which we can convey to our policymakers, to our elected members of parliaments, or to our governments, in a way in which they can use this information to take action. There is no doubt that there is a huge amount of complex climate information. And we've heard about some of the ways in which that data is put together, the way it's modeled. So I think this is a great concern to me. And I think there are 2 or 3 issues that are of utmost importance in translating this information into action through the policy activities of governments. First of all, I think as scientists, we have to be very clear in what the messages are that we need to get across. We need to ensure that science is seen as being independent, that it is not a corollary of funding from particular sources, but that science is a unique way of being able to translate and communicate information about the real world, so that it is reliable and independent. Secondly, I think we have to be much more sophisticated about uncertainty, about what we do know, but more about what we don't know. I think in the past we've tended to rather gloss over a lot of the complexities and the uncertainties and lack of knowledge or data in order to get a message across to our politicians. But politicians and government officials are canny. They are particularly individuals that have an insight into the way in which human beings operate. So I think we have to get over the risks, the threats. We have to explain probability and uncertainty in more sophisticated terms, but nevertheless to try to get that over simply so that that can be translated into policy action. I also think that one of the biggest issues for politicians, for governments, is the general public's view, because they are elected by the votes of the general public. So there's an important connection for scientists, not only to speak to politicians, but we also have to influence politicians to speak to the public, as well as scientists having a voice with the public themselves. And I just reflect on this. In many countries around the world, and I've been deeply impressed on what's happening here in Hong Kong, and yesterday I was at a meeting where we were hearing about the policies for climate change in cities such as Toronto and Hong Kong and London. And of course we have got, later in the week, we'll hear much more about the city-focused issues. There are plans being put forward. Plans to tackle climate change, plans to look at adaptation, plans to reformulate the way in which cities operate in a low-carbon, greener economy. This is fine, but the real issue is how they get translated into action. And that really depends on the will of governments to push it forward against what they perceive as being the reactions of the public that will vote for them. And in Europe, and I'll just speak from my backyard in Europe at the moment, most people, most individuals, most of us as citizens have heard about climate change. It's in the media, it's on TV, there are documentaries, there are news programs, and we see it in newspapers. So we know about it. But the real issue is how it will affect us as individuals in the future. And there's a great concern that climate change is equivalent to a reduction in our standards of living. And this is a reaction you see in Europe and I think in North America.